Ah, Hollywood. The place where dreams become reality. Well, at least through a digital lens. It wasn't always the place we know it to be today. Welcome to That's a Wrap, the brief history of Hollywood. I'm your host, Zachary, and today we'll be going over on how Hollywood came to be and its importance. Hollywood originally started out in the North. Thomas Edison invented the kinetoscope and camera, all vital technology for the film industry. However, contrary to popular belief, studios did not move out of Hollywood due to Edison's fees to use his equipment. They actually moved out because California was the prime location for the most popular genre at the time, westerns. As the 20th century began and Hollywood, or should I say Hollywood land, started to have 8 production studios pop up like MGM, Universal, Warner Brothers, Paramount, Fox, RKO, Columbia, and eventually, Disney. With Walt's drive to innovate animation, he created Steamboat Willie, the very first film with audio that was released in 1928. This would actually influence the rest of the studios who were seeing this man with a very small team rise up out of nowhere and essentially just take their money. So they had to hop on it too. So talkies were starting to be everywhere. With the release of The Jazz Singer in 1927, the golden age of Hollywood began. This age ran for 3 decades, going from the late 20s to the late 50s. With emerging stars like Charlie Chaplin, studios relied on the same group of actors to make a profit. Theaters were even owned by studios, and they could only show their own films in the theater. Monopolies were extremely common in the film industry back in the day, and even today with, ironically enough, Disney. Due to strict rules actors had on them with studios, the Screen Actors Guild, or SAG, was created in 1933. Later that year, SAG was actually protesting against unfair conditions and pay, which eventually worked, both times. At this point in Hollywood's extensive history, monochrome films were all that existed due to the technological extent at the time. However, in the late 30s, there existed this studio wanting to adapt a little novel written in 1900 by L. Frank Baum, with new technology they wanted to showcase. The 1939 film The Wizard of Oz was released, making the first film to be made with Technicolor technology. This revolutionized Hollywood and changed the game forever. As time progressed and technology increased, the 1960s were considered as the start of a renaissance in film, with big hits, or big blockbuster hits, should I say, like A Fistful of Dollars, Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Following that was the 1970s, which I would say had an even more iconic film dominate its time period. The release of George Lucas's Star Wars, blockbuster culture had launched itself into a new swing. And after the release of Star Wars, the sci-fi and home video landscape of the 1980s and 90s dominated the field. And finally, in today's scape, superhero movies and elevated horror are the dominating force of Hollywood. But Hollywood hasn't always been used for innovation in audio, video, and technology, and creativity. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the start of the U.S. involvement in World War II, the U.S. government had pro-war films be made and released to be viewed by the U.S. citizens and encourage them to enlist or support the war effort. But if Hollywood is forced to change slightly due to societal reasons, has it happened before? Actually, no. Well, kind of. Hollywood is one of the only industries to not be affected by the Great Depression, the Great Recession, or any other issues besides World War II. Mostly. With McCarthyism on the rise, the Hollywood 10 were soon blacklisted from Hollywood due to suspicions of communism. They couldn't fight back legally, and eventually lost their inevitable battle for their reputations and jobs. On a more positive note, on the other hand, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there was a rise in films showcasing unlikely dynamics like LGBTQ couples, minorities, and women in more leading roles. But female leads were more showcased in television over feature-length films. With the rise of television situational comedies, or sitcoms for short, a more diverse characters were shown, and would typically leave a longer span of time on air and with the public. Friends created this huge fan base and memorable moments that shows and movies even reference today. I Love Lucy, The Office, which had a similar impact that Friends had, and Parks and Rec, starring Amy Poehler, and causing Chris Pratt his breakout role. As good as life is on television is shown to be, behind the camera, however, is not. Again, mentioning The Wizard of Oz, Judy Garland and Margaret Hamilton weren't so lucky with their time on set. Margaret Hamilton had severe burns from the scenes where the Wicked Witch melts, and that's just one example from her. And Judy Garland is just a tragedy of a case. Everything that happened on that set was approved by MGM. So it's kind of a good thing either way that SAG exists, and protested because who knows what it has prevented on other sets. As great as Hollywood is, it's truly a terrible place sometimes. But I think that's what makes it history, and everyone knowing that history really helps it to not repeat itself. Going off from the dapper, on a more positive note, in late 2024, Media for Texas was fighting and proposing for Hollywood to come to Texas. As of May 2026, Paramount is projected to move to Fort Worth along with Universal and Warner Brothers. Landman and The Chosen both film in Fort Worth and Midlothian, and a handful of colleges and universities in Texas are considered the best of the best in film programs. So, as the history of Hollywood continues to grow, it's best to know it rather than to let it die and be repeated. I'm your host, Zachary, and you just watched The History of Hollywood.